Hi everyone, myself Dr. M. Lakshmi Prasad, working as an associate professor in data science department in Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. So in this video, I'm going to discuss about what are the various sources of secondary data. So in previous video, I discussed regarding how the primary data is going to be collected, what are the various sources of primary data, right? So now in this video, I'm going to discuss about what are the various sources of the secondary data. Let me explain that how collection of data first, then we're going to see about what are the various sources of the secondary data. So the process of systematic gathering of the data for a particular purpose from various sources that has been systematically observed, recorded and organized. So the collection of data is very important as I said previously, and the process of gathering the data is very important since we have to collect the data either in the form of observation, or you can able to collect the data in the form of a recorded one, or you can able to collect the data and where you can able to organize the data where that come from various sources. And this is the very first step of the statistical study, and there are several ways of collecting data also. And then there are various procedures that are available to collect the data from various sources, but that may be depending on the design of the study as well as the availability of the time, money and personnel. So the sources of data are going to be classified into two categories here. So very first one is that external sources, and second one is that internal sources. So external sources again will be of two types. So first one is primary data and second one is the secondary data here. So what are the examples of primary data will be documents, and then creative works, and then interviews, man-made material things, and then surveys. Similarly, when it comes to secondary data, the various examples will be unpublished thesis and dissertations, manuscript, books, and journals. So these are the various sources of the secondary data, right? So the sources of the data is going to be classified into two categories. So very first one is that external source, and second one is that internal source. So the primary data and then secondary data will be the other two categories of these external sources of the data. So the primary data examples will be documents, and then creative works, interviews, man-made material things, surveys. Whereas when it comes to secondary data, the unpublished thesis, dissertations, manuscript, books, journals, and etc. So these are the examples of the secondary data. So what are the differences between internal and external sources of the data? We'll see now. So when it comes to internal sources of the data, so many institutions and departments have information about their regular functions and for their own internal purposes. That should be internal source of the data. Whereas when it comes to external source of the data, so when information is collected from outside agencies, is called external source of the data. So many institutions that have department, right? So that one is going to maintain some information about their regular functions and for their internal purposes. Whereas when it comes to external sources of the data, so the information is going to be collected from outside agencies. That one should be considered as external source of the data. Similarly, in internal sources of the data, so when the information are going to be used in survey, so that one should be called as a internal source of the data. So the survey, we are going to gather so many data, right? So for various purposes in order to perform the research and all. So that data will be considered as a internal source of the data. And then the data which is going to be there may be either primary one or it may be secondary one, so that should be considered as the external source of the data. So the example of this internal source of the data will be social welfare society. And then when it comes to external source of the data, so the information that is going to be collected by a census or sampling method, that should be considered as the external source of the data here. So what is the secondary data? We'll see now. So the secondary data is one of the type of the data that has been already collected and then analyzed by some earlier agencies for its own use, and later the same data is going to be used by the different agency. That should be considered as a secondary data. The secondary data is nothing but is one type of data which has been already collected, right? So the already existing will be considered, and data will be considered as a secondary data, and then that data is going to be analyzed by some earlier agencies for its own purpose. Later on, the same data is going to be used by the different agency, that should be considered as a secondary data. The sources of this secondary data will be again of two types. So first one is published sources, and second one is that unpublished sources. So the published sources and unpublished sources we'll see now, and then these are the primary sources. So published one means already there are different ways or that where the data is already published, whether it may be in newspapers or articles or journals, whatever it may be. And unpublished sources means where the data is unable to get it right, that should be considered as a unpublished sources. So let's see what is the meant by published sources. So various governmental, international, and other agencies publish statistical data, right? So that data will be considered as a published sources. So various governmental data, or either international data or local agencies statistical data, right? Those data will be considered as a published sources here. And the international, some of this published sources again classified into different publications, like international publications and official publications of the government, and semi-office publications. So international publications is nothing but those are UNO, and then WHO, Nature, etc. These and all will be considered as a internal publications. And other official publications of the government may be, so depend Department of Drug Administration, Central Bureau of Investigations. These and all will be the official publications of the government. And then the semi-official publications will be some semi-government institutions like municipal corporation, district board, and then publish reports, etc. So this and all will be considered as a published sources. So the various governments and international and local agencies, what the data that are maintained, so that and all will comes under published sources. So these published sources will be again of three categories. So first one is international publication. So they are UNO, WHO, and then Nature, etc. And then official publications of government will be Department of Drug Administration, and then Central Bureau of Statistics. So this is the second type of published sources. And then semi-official publications, so that may be semi-government institutions like municipal corporation, district board, etc. That one should be considered as a published reports, that and all will be considered as a published sources. And some other types of published sources will be the publications of research institutions like Nepal Government Research Institution and Nepalese Journal of Ophthalmology, etc. So that one should be considered as a publications of research institution which can able to publish and they're finding these research programs. And then second one is that journals and then newspapers also. This one is also be considered as a published sources. So the current and important materials on the statistics and then socio-economic problems which can be obtained from various journals and newspapers like Swasthya Khabar Patrika and then Health Today magazine, the site, etc. So these and all will be considered as a published sources, right? So the data what we are going to gather for to make research from the various journals as well as the newspapers. So newspapers is going to hold a lot of data, right? So then the present world there are different types of newspapers also available where we can able to extract a lot of data, right? So those and all will be considered as a published sources, right? So the published sources will be the either international publications and then official publications of the government and then semi-office publications and then publications of research institutions and then journals and newspapers. So these are the various published sources of the secondary data. Let's come to the unpublished sources. So here we are going to records maintained by the various government and private officers will be considered as a unpublished sources. right? So the data which is going to be maintained by the various government and then private offices, that one should be considered as a unpublished sources. So the researches is going to be carried out by the individual research scholars in the universities or research institutions, right? So those and all will be the unpublished sources. So since the researcher is going to carry out the research, various research, still the research what they are done by the research college not going to be published anywhere. So that's why they are going to publish the data in various universities and then various research institutions through journals only. So that data will be considered as a unpublished sources. And then, according to Bowley, it is never safe to take a published statistics at their face value, so without their meaning and the limitation. And it is always necessary to criticize arguments that can be based on them. So this is the word that should be suggested by the Professor Bowley. So that is the statement is it is never safe to take the published statistic at their face value, so without knowing their meaning and then limitations. So and it is also be very necessary to utilize the arguments that can be based on them. And then what are the various precautions we're going to see in the use of the secondary data. So before going to use the secondary data, the investigator should be able to consider the following factors. These factors will be suitability of the data and then adequacy of the data and then reliability of the data. So these are all very important. So when an investigator is going to gather the data from the multiple sources, right? So what is the very first factor that the investigator should do is suitability of the data. So the data what we are going to gather from the multiple sources, whether that data is suitable for the particular application or not, we have to be check it out. So without suitability, it is unable to predict the data for a particular application. Suppose if I am going to collect the data for a particular application, let it be stock market, I want to know it, right? So the data what I'm getting from the particular company, that is a suitable one or not, I have to find it out. And then adequacy. So adequacy of the data is also be very important. So that should be very careful by the investigator, so in order to maintain that. And then reliability. So reliability of the data is also be very important. So, what are the factors that should be investigators should do in order to perform, in order to make use of the secondary data should be is suitability data and then adequacy of the data and then reliability of the data. So these three factors are very important while gathering or while using the use of secondary data. And then the secondary data must possess the following characteristics. So very first one should be reliability of the data. So that may be tested by checking so who collected the data. So reliability of the data is going to be checked by asking some questions like who collected the data and what were the sources of the data, was the data collected properly or not. So these questions are very important before checking the reliability of the data. So reliability of the data may be lies who collect the data, who is the person that collected the data is very important. So whether it is the primary person or it may be a secondary person, who, whether the user is collected the data or some administrative role is have collected the data or not, that and all will be identified. And what were the sources of the data, where the data is coming from. So whether it may be a primary source or it may be a secondary source. So again, the primary source, there may be a lot of questionnaires that is going to be asked by the respondent, or it may be secondary source, means whether the data is going to be gathered from the journals, magazines or newspapers, just now I said, right? So the sources of the data will be primary source and then secondary sources. So the secondary source, just now I said, right, newspapers and then journals, magazines like this. So these are the what are the sources where we are going to collect the data. That should be also very important. So was the collected data properly? So what is the data I'm collecting? So from primary and then secondary, so that one is the that we collected properly or not. So whether you have to extract whole data or you have to take some partial data or have to extract some partial as well as whole, like that you have to be very careful while collecting the data properly. So these are all the questions that may relies on the reliability of the data. And then the second one is that suitability of the data. So suitability of the data is also important. So the data would be suitable for one inquiry that may not be necessarily suitable in another inquiry. Suppose what is the data I'm collecting, right? So whether the data is suitable for that particular application or not, that one is to be identified. If it is suitable, then you have to be take it out. Suppose once it is not suitable, you have to be leave it out. So what is the data that is suitable is going to be used, that may not be used in another application, right? So that suitability is also very important while processing one of the characteristics of the secondary data. And then so before going to see the suitability of the data, so we have to identify the objective, scope and nature of the original inquiry that must be studied. So in order to see that the suitability of the data, so the objective, scope and nature of the original inquiry should also be studied. Without doing that, we should not unable to check whether that one is the suitable data or not. So suppose if the data is suitable or not, what you have to do, you have to see the objectives of the study or objectives of the application, and then we have to see the scope of the application and then what nature of that application process. So based on that only I can able to predict the suitability of the data. And then next one is that adequacy of the data. Adequacy in the sense the data is considered to be inadequate. So if they are related to the area which may be either narrower or wider than the area of the present inquiry, right? So the data is considered to be inadequate. Suppose if they are related to the area which may be either narrower or wider than the area of the present inquiry, that should be considered as the adequacy of the. So adequacy means that the data is going to be considered inadequate. Suppose if the data is inadequate, what we have to do, we have to be said that the data what is related to that area needs to be either narrower one or wider than that one, have to be see out. So these are the some of the characteristics that the secondary data may be processed. So very first one is the reliability of the data, and then suitability of the data, and then adequacy of the data. So reliability of the data means, so who are going to collect the data is very important, and then what were the sources of the data is also very important, and then was the data collected properly. So this based on these questions only, then reliability of the data depends, and then suitability of the data also be depends. And let me show so what are the differences between the primary data and then secondary data. So when it comes to primary data, the primary data should be a real-time data, right? So the real-time data will be considered as the primary data. And then it should be the sure about the sources of the data. So we have some particular sure where the data is coming from. That should be the primary data. And it also helps to give results and then findings. And then it should be a costly one and time consuming process, and then you should be able to avoid the business of responses data, and it should be in more flexible form. So these are the various points or factors that are related to the primary data. So the primary data what we are going to see, that should be the real-time data, and then sure about where the data is coming from, and then the primary data mainly helpful in giving the results and then finding, and then it should be a costly one, and then it should also be a time-consuming process. So this primary data is going to be avoid the businesses of responses data, and it should be more flexible one. Similarly, when it comes to secondary data, the data past data. So past data should be considered as a secondary data, and then it should not be not sure about the sources of the data. So secondary data means the data what we're collecting from secondary, that and all is not suitable. So we're not sure so where the data is coming from. That's why so the refining of the problem is also very important if you're going to see the secondary data. But the data since but it should be a cheap and no time consuming process, since already the data is published one, right? That should be the secondary data. So due to that, it should be cheap one and no time consuming process, and cannot know in data biasness or not. So this is another disadvantage. And then it should be also less flexible. So these are the some of the points that regarding to the secondary data. So differences is that so the primary data should be a real-time data, and the secondary data should be a past data. And then primary data should be sure about the sources of the data, whereas secondary data is not sure about the sources of the data. And then this primary data helps in giving the results and findings, whereas the refining the problem is the and the difference compared to the primary data. It should be a costly one, but the secondary data should be a cheap one. And then that should be a time consuming process, and there is no time consuming process are going to maintain in secondary data. And then you should avoid the biasness of the response data, that but here you cannot know in the data biasness or not. And then it should be a more flexible one, and it should be less flexible one. So these are some of the differences between the primary and the secondary data. And let's see that what should be the assessment of the qualitative data. So the assessment of the qualitative data is going to be classified into different types. First one is that direct observation, and then in-depth interview, case study, triangulation, and then use of secondary data. So right, so these are some of the various methods that are available for the qualitative data collection. So in previous video I said what is the data and what are the various forms of the data, or what are the various classifications of the data. So the data is going to be classified in two categories, like qualitative data and then quantitative data, right? So here the qualitative data is going to be maintained in this as the secondary data. So what are the characteristics and the traits for the which the numerical value cannot be assigned or called the qualitative data. So the data which is going to be gathered based on attributes, that one should be considered as the qualitative data. So example, gender, color, honesty, like that. So these are the some of the various attributes or various examples of the qualitative data, and there are several methods are available for collecting the qualitative data. So the methods of qualitative data will be direct observation is the one, and in-depth review is the interview is the other one, and then case study is also one of the application of the qualitative data. And then triangulation also another important method that is going to be used in assessing the qualitative data, and then the uses of the secondary data. So these are the various methods that are available. So the characteristic, the traits for which the numerical value is not going to be changed, that one should be considered as qualitative data. So the data which is going to be gathered from various attributes like gender, color, and honesty, that one should be considered as a qualitative data. Then so let's see one by one. And this classification of qualitative data again divided into three categories. So first one should be geographical classification, and then second one is the chronological classification, and third one is the qualitative classification. So these three classifications should be the various types of the qualitative data. So suppose if I take geographical classification, so this one should be one of the example of the qualitative data, and the chronological classification and qualitative classification, like that. And the next one should be a tabulation of qualitative data here. So the qualitative data values cannot be observed by a frequency distribution, and this frequency distribution list is going to have each of these categories or the frequency account for the each categories. right? So whatever the data we are going to assess, that one should be represented in the form of a tables here. So the qualitative data values should be organized by a frequency distribution, and this frequency distribution is able to maintain two types of factors. First one should be what type of category it is, and then how what is the frequency or counts of this each category. So let me explain the example through the example. Suppose I'm taking the characteristic as one column and population as the second column, and percentage will be on third column. Suppose characteristics I'm taking as male, so in population, how many number of male people are available, and what type of what is the percentage of the male. Similarly, if I'm going to take female, so, right? So what should be the population in millions, and what should be the percentage of the female. So by adding this, I can able to get the total value of this population, and like this I'm going to assess the qualitative data by using the frequency distribution table. So what is a frequency distribution table? Let me explain that. So the frequency distribution table is nothing but a simple data set. So that should be represented in the form of caret, right? Caret, and then ketoconus and glaucoma, and then glaucoma caret and glaucoma caret. So like this, the data is going to be classified. So caret to caret, or caret to keratinus, and then glaucoma to cataract. Like this, I can able to represent the data set. So let's see the example of frequency table for the qualitative data. So I'm taking here three eye conditions like cataract, and then keratinus, and then glaucoma. So I can able to make the combination of cataract to cataract, and then cataract to keratinus, and then keratinus to glaucoma, or cataract to glaucoma. Like this, I can able to make this differences also. Like this, I can able to maintain the data set also. Suppose by seeing this, I can able to know that how many number of times that cataract is repeating. Let it be 1, 2, and then 3 and 4. So frequency is 4. And then keratinus, how many number of times? So it is 1, right? So that should be 1 here. And the glaucoma, so the glaucoma is to be another data that is available in the frequency table. So how many number of times it is repeating? So 1, 2, and then 3. So that should be the 3 frequency. So like this, I can able to fill this frequency table here. So by defining the data set. So let me take one example is milk, and then eggs, and then bread and jam. So in a supermarket, I would like to know how many number of people are going to purchase this milk daily, and then eggs daily, and then bread daily, and then jam daily. So how many number of people are going to see purchase these items very frequently? I would like to know it. So based on that, so suppose if a number of people are going to take milk every day 10 times, like eggs should be 15, and then bread should be 5, and jam should be 2. So what should be the frequency of this one? So the frequency is more in eggs and then milk. I can able to take the combination also, milk and eggs, and then milk and bread, and then eggs and jam. Like that, this combination also could be taken, right? So based on that also, I can able to calculate the frequency. The most occurring eye condition is granted by seeing this example. And the next one is that what is the relative frequency. So relative frequency or the proportions or the percents of the observation of the total, that one should be considered as the relative frequency. So the relative frequencies or the proportions or percents of the observation out of the total, that should be relative frequency. And then this relative frequency distributions is going to maintain this each of the categories, and then relative frequency of the each category. So there is a relative frequency is equal to the frequency of the items by total number of items, right? So the relative frequency is nothing but, so the relative frequencies are the proportions or the percentage of observations of the total, and this relative frequencies is going to be applied on the each of the category, or I can able to apply this relative frequencies of the each category. So the relative frequency is going to be calculated by frequency by the number of total. So let me explain this relative frequency table by taking an example. So the relative frequency table for the qualitative data. So this should be considered a refractive error, and what should be the relative frequency. So first one is cat rate. So cat rate relative frequency will be 0.4500. So how it is coming? So no, number of frequencies of the cat rate is 4, and then what should be total number of this? 4, 8. So 4 divided by 8, how much? 0.5. So that should be the relative frequency. So see the example here. So the relative frequency is equal to frequency of the items by the total number of items. So this is the equation we are maintaining here. So here the cat rate is having 4 times repeating by seeing the previous example. So the total out of which 8. That's why 4 divided by 8 here. So that is 0.5. And what should be the correctness? So correctness is occurring only one time. So out of 8, so 1 by 8 is how much? 0.1.25. So that should be the relative frequency value. And glaucoma, so glaucoma is frequency of this item is 3, and out of 8 that should be 3.75. So like this I can able to calculate the relative frequencies of the table. So the relative frequency of the table can be constructed based on the percent. So by seeing this, what should be the percent? 50%. So what's by seeing, if I going to apply percent? 12.5%. By 375 means I can able to see 37.5%. So like this I can able to assess the qualitative data. So based on frequency table, based on the frequency table I can able to identify that. And the next one is that relative frequency also I can able to assess the qualitative data. And next one is that, so what are the various ways of graphical representation of the qualitative data? So the graphical representation of the qualitative data are going to represent it in the either in the form of bar diagram, or I can able to represent this qualitative data either in the form of pie diagram or sector diagram. And I can also be able to represent this qualitative data either also in the form of line diagram, and then what is the other way is pictogram. So pictogram is also able to represent this qualitative data, and then map diagram or cartogram. So these are the various ways of that presenting the qualitative data by taking the consideration of frequency distribution and then relative frequency distribution. So very first one is bar diagram. So how to take consider the data and then how to represent it in the form of bars. That should be the bar diagram. So in future videos I'm going to discuss what are the ways of representing graphical representation of the data. And then pie or sector diagram. So we can able to represent the data in the form of various sectors. That should be a sector diagram or pie diagram. And then I can able to represent the data in the form of lines. I want to show it as a graph, then so that I can able to identify the distributions. Mainly can able to identify this in cricket matches and stock market analysis. We can able to see that, right? Line diagram. And then pictogram. So pictogram is another kind of way of representing this of qualitative data, where you can able to show the data in the form of pictures itself. That's why you can able to call it as a pictogram. And then next one is that map diagram or cartogram. So map diagram or cartogram means we can able to represent the data in the map itself, or I can also able to represent it in the form of cartogram, right? So these are the various graphical representations of this qualitative data. So very first one is bar diagram, so where you can able to represent it in the form of bars. And then second one is the pie diagram or sector diagram, so where you can able to represent that in the form of pie, or you can able to represent in the form of sector. And then line diagram, so line diagram is very important, so where you can able to represent it in the form of lines. And then pictogram, so pictogram is also important, where you can able to represent the data in the form of pictures, right? A map diagram, so map diagram or cartogram, where you can able to represent directly in the form of maps. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.